Hi Karen, can you hear me? Yay, look at that.
Yay!
Isn't that wonderful when it works?
I know it's great. Yeah, quite right. It's great when it works, and it's really rubbish when you're sitting there thinking, "Is it going to work? Is it going to work?"
Oh dear, oh dear. I've
It's
wanted the wrong country.
amazing.
Good. So tonight we're joined by the lovely Karen Harrison. I'm going to talk about estrogen metabolism and just generally understanding menopause and how much our genetics plays a part in that. So the reason that we're doing this tonight is because lots of people have, and lots of patients of mine often say, you know, my mum or my sister were totally horrendous during menopause and they went loopy and I'm scared for what's happening to me. So we've got our expert here, lovely Karen, who's going to explain to us about whether, you know, our genes are our destiny or whether we can manipulate those. So I'll send it over to you, my lovely friend.
Oh, bless you. Thank you. Well, look, there is, we are in a world where unfortunately things are sort of almost sort of against us, and there are occasions where some women really do have really bad menopauses. And I've got 3 clients at the moment, and to be honest with you, bless them, I don't even know how they're going to work in the first place. So, it can be a real pain. So, from a genetic perspective, we would at least look at the estrogen pathways, and we would look at other things as well, but it just depends on what that person's actually what their symptoms are. So for instance, if somebody has or is in menopause and they're having hot flushes or flashes, depending on how you want to see it in the world, a lot of the time it's actually being caused by inflammation. And inflammation in general, which most of us will know what causes that, it can be an environmental, it can be what you're eating, etc. But from a genetic perspective, there are a couple of genes that we would look at that if you do have SNPs, so in other words, that spelling mistake in the sentence of the gene, then that can predispose you to a higher risk of inflammation in the first place. So when we get to that menopause time and the estrogen starts to drop, it actually heightens that effect. And so this is why some women actually do have hot flashes. They have inflammatory sort of well, I guess really symptoms that we could perhaps have tried to reduce prior to actually getting to that stage. And we can do that by checking somebody's genetics.
Okay, so just from what I see from patients' point of view, like some people, so lots of people drink caffeine, right, all the way through their life, and then suddenly they get to menopause and they're getting flushes. I know I personally get much more hot sweats or night sweats if I drink too much tea or coffee. So is there something in our genetics that determines whether we're enabled to process caffeine or not, which would then influence how we approach menopause?
Sure. So estrogen is an amazing protective hormone, and so when we are when we're drinking caffeine and prior to menopause, the body almost can just sort of deal with it. But once we've lost that protection of the estrogen, with the ability to actually metabolize the caffeine, it doesn't changes, but it's actually heightened in the body. You actually realize it more. And so that's why, unfortunately, for some women, caffeine can actually increase that effect of having hot flushes or whatever it might be. And what it's doing is it's increasing that inflammation. And there's a particular SNP that we would look at, which is the CYP1A2. And we would also look at the ADORA2 gene as well. And we would look at both of those in order to see whether you are predisposed to that. And of course, then if you are, we can do something about it. It's all about finding out, and can we do something about it? And if we can, take some really good steps in order to do so, whether it be nutrition, herbal, etc.
So I would say to my clients that they shouldn't have caffeine, right? And they're moving menopause. So what would you say from a genetic point of view?
Well, from a genetic perspective, probably 75% of the women who are drinking caffeine, once they hit menopause, they'll have those symptoms. So unfortunately, about 75% of women, I also would say, please don't drink caffeine. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So reducing those kind of risk factors.
Yeah.
And then in terms of inflammation, so lots of women as they approach menopause have bone pain.
Yes.
So I see lots of women who are quite sporty. So women who are runners or do kind of any kind of excessive cycling, gym work. So is there something we can watch for from a genetic point of view there?
And I'm going to do a bit of an explanation as to what's going on and then link it back into genes. So estrogen is a real good protector of the mucosal lining of the gut. So when you go through menopause, obviously we have that drop of estrogen, and then we have what's sometimes termed as leaky junction. So we then have proteins going into the areas of the body that aren't supposed to be there. That provokes an immune response. Once that immune response has actually been recognised, it has, well, basically there's loads of research now to say that basically it's promoting osteoclast activity. And osteoclast activity is the breakdown of the bone, and we want osteoblasts. Now, of course, we're not going to build bone like when we're really old, but what we don't want to do is we don't want to enhance the osteoclast activity. So if we've lost the estrogen protection and we've got, endotoxins and lipopolysaccharides going everywhere, it provokes this immune response, which then promotes osteoclast activity. Now, you can be much more predisposed to that from a particular gene called TNFS11, I think it's called, off the top of my head. And basically it means that you have a higher risk of that happening when the estrogen drops. So I don't know if you get a lot of your clients saying to you, Ree, that they get real sort of, they can't eat the same types of foods that they used to be able to eat, because they then get sort of these weird sort of digestive sort of symptoms.
Yeah.
And that's potentially what's going on. Yeah, absolutely.
Carbohydrates. So lots of the patients that I see, they eat the same amount of calories, moving up to menopause, and then suddenly they're gaining more weight. And it's from my interpretation is that they can't process carbohydrates in the same way. Yeah, so absolutely. What would your interpretation of that be?
Yeah, so basically the ability to act for the insulin to do what it needs to do is not as effective as we would like it to be. Now, at the moment, I'd love to be able, there are some glucose genes that we know about, but actual insulin genes tend to be, so the scientific stuff is all about type 1 diabetes. So, of course, that's not the same for people that don't have that. So the actual gene for insulin dysregulation isn't quite there yet, but I do look at glucose genes, and to be honest with you, anybody that's got SNPs on those, then yeah, they have issues with the ability to actually deal with the glucose after the estrogen has dropped.
Yeah, so people who tend to have sugar cravings or are vulnerable around sugar, yes, that becomes heightened, doesn't it, in menopause? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And the trouble is, you're then at that stage where you're feeling stressed a bit more, because the drop in estrogen is also then, it's not helping with your dopamine levels. So you feel anxious more, you feel, that the stress that you used to be able to deal with, even if it's at work or whatever, you are less able to do so because you've got that change in the dopamine levels. And so therefore you sometimes you will crave it, you will cave in more often once you've gone through the menopause, and then you've got that end result, basically. Yeah.
So what can we do in order to increase our dopamine naturally then?
So dopamine naturally, what we can do is we want to help with omega-3, spinach, eggs, seeds, nuts, those sort of things. And also the B vitamins, zinc is a major one as well. So as long as you're eating a really good, wholesome intake, that's fine. If you So I've just asked one of the clients who now just has lost all sort of interest in healthy cooking. So I've got them onto one of the meal prep sort of companies, because I know that we can then see what they're actually eating. It's a short-term thing, but it means that I know that they're having a wholesome food intake, instead of them going, can't be bothered, I'll go to whatever's the easiest thing to grab. So sometimes you have to put these things into place to get them to the stage where they then feel better, and then they can then start cooking properly for themselves.
Okay, amazing. So just from just talking about perimenopause and people approaching menopause. So my experience is that when people approach menopause and they're really depleted from a nutrient point of view, then they just don't do so well. And also people who've been, you know, dopamine junkies, if you like, approaching menopause, doing lots of, you know, lots of coffee, lots of bungee jumps, lots of running, lots of crazy activities, then they hit menopause like it's a brick wall. So one of the things that I wanted to ask you or to talk about was how, you know, nutrient testing for genetic vulnerabilities for nutrients can really impact how you approach menopause.
Yeah.
So could you talk a bit about that?
Sure. So basically, I've got probably about 15, maybe 20 now, genetic markers in regards to all of the main vitamins and minerals that you need in order just to support life in general, but also more important for when you're going through menopause. And effectively what I would then do is actually optimize the intake of what you need. I would then also potentially use another test to actually look at the levels as they currently are. So you look at the genetics first, and then I would use another test to actually see whether they are actually nutriently depleted actually now, so vitamin D and all that sort of stuff. And then I would then support them and really build them up prior to actually menopause actually happening, because you're quite right. If they are depleted, then the liver's going to have a bit of an issue. Then basically they hit it like a train. And what they used to do, even from a job perspective, they just can't do it. They just, you know, they just snap at the smallest thing. And even just sort of being able to run an office, whether you're an office manager, for instance, it just becomes too much. And it's literally going through that fluctuation prior to menopause. So some months you're good, some months you're not. And of course, bless them, all the people around them don't really know what to do, because they become this different person.
Yeah, so what I hear a lot is that women see red, right? So for things that probably wouldn't have bothered them before. Yes. From my point of view, I just think magnesium, L-theanine. But, you know, what you're kind of saying is that if they look at their genetics, which quite frankly, it's not a push, but I just think it's really good for everyone to do, because if you know what your health vulnerabilities are from a point of view, then you can always catch something before you become deficient. So vitamin C, for example, vitamin C goes to make collagen. Collagen will help repair connective tissue. Yes. That means that if you're low in vitamin C, you'll therefore have a propensity for varicose veins, hemorrhoids, skin issues, which becomes magnified when you get into menopause. So I think what I understand, or what I'm hearing you're saying, is that do the genetic testing, because that's like your roadmap for the future. Yeah. And then in the moment, as you think you might be approaching menopause, have a look at what nutrients you're depleted in, so that then you can catch those deficiencies. So the women that go into menopause that are not depleted seem to do much better than those that are really depleted. So going into it in an empty state when you've been an adrenaline junkie for too long, you know, kind of painful path really to take.
Yes.
And I mean, how easy is it to do these tests, Karen?
Oh, very, very easy. You just basically it's a swab that's a bit like a squished cotton bud, effectively, and you place that on the inside of your cheek on one side, and you rub that along the cheek for 30 seconds, and then do the same for the other side, and then basically you put it in this little tube, snap the handle off, it actually takes you longer to fill out the consent form than it is to actually do the sample itself. And then basically you send that back to me, and I'll obviously send it off to the lab. I know some people are a bit sort of scared about confidentiality. So first of all, the lab never gets any information about the client itself. So your sample, the little tube that you send back, has what we call an empty barcode on it. So it's just got a number on it. And then basically it's that goes to the lab. So the lab will only know that sample via that number. That's it. And then it obviously comes back to me, and then I will obviously then send it on to the appropriate person. So the lab never, ever, ever has anything to do with any information. To a lab, you are just a number.
Yeah, so that's good.
Yeah.
Just before we kind of close it down, I just want to talk a little bit about estrogen and progesterone. And the kind of misnomer here is that, so in menopause, estrogen starts to decline, but what people don't often realize is that progesterone is even lower and starts to decline further. So even though you're in menopause or perimenopause, you can still be in estrogen dominance, right?
Absolutely.
And then you're seeing the signs of estrogen dominance, like breast tenderness before menstruation, kind of hot flushes, psychotic tendencies is the best way to put it, and very heavy menstrual cycle. So how do you catch that on a genetic test, Karen?
So basically, I would look at the life cycle of estrogen, and there are certain points within its life cycle that, from a genetic perspective, might mean it almost has sticking points, if you see what I mean. So you might be able to create estrogen quite happily, but there are particular genes that have to do, so then they have to almost, if you think about as your estrogen going along a conveyor belt, there's a particular gene that has to almost sort of give something to the estrogen in order for it to go to the next stop. And unfortunately, that tends to be really slow. So that's the COMT gene. And so you sometimes can be really good, or most women are really good at making estrogen. Is actually the breakdown or the ability to get rid of it that starts to be the beginning of their problem. And it's the methylation of that estrogen for some women can actually be the sticking point. So once it's methylated, they can then get rid of it. But when you've got SNPs on COMT, it just means it's actually slower at what it's doing. So therefore, you can't get rid of it as well. So you've actually got it hanging around for longer. So hence why you've potentially got, estrogen dominance.
So can you just explain a bit more about methylation and what it means? Just because a few people are like, what the hell?
So methylation is it's a biochemical pathway that basically means that there are certain things or certain metabolites or hormones or whatever it might be needs to have what's known as a methyltransferase added to it. Now that methyltransferase, if it's not added to the hormone, whatever it is it's trying to be added to, it means it cannot go or do the next process. So methylation itself is all about the body producing something that's called a methyltransferase. So in other words, this particular chemical has to be attached to the hormone so that it can actually be detoxed and then got rid of in the body. So methylation is all about S-adenosine methionine. So it's a type of amino acid that has been metabolized in a different way. So it's just been changed very slightly. So without that actually happening properly, which it can be quite slow, the hormone, so the estrogen, doesn't have that methyltransferase added to it efficiently. It will definitely happen. It's not a case of it's not happening. It just means it's not happening as efficiently as some other people. So it's just a biochemical pathway that basically means that you're producing something which is known as a methyltransferase, and you are then basically adding it to something else. And in this case, it's estrogen. And once it's been added, it's then in a form that the body can then take it to the next step and actually start to get rid of it.
But how do we improve that then if people are poor methylators then? Just
So
don't methylate that
sure.
well.
So the COMT gene itself is actually magnesium dependent. So again, we need to make sure that we've got magnesium-rich foods going in, or just checking to see your magnesium levels. Because again, if you're really low, even if you don't have a SNP on COMT, if you haven't got sufficient amounts of magnesium, that will slow the process down.
And so let's say you have got a SNP on COMT, then what should you be careful of in terms of making COMT do its job better, if you like?
It's got to be all about magnesium. It's all got to be about B vitamins and zinc.
And what about caffeine? What does caffeine do to the COMT gene?
Yeah, so caffeine is going to affect the COMT gene even more. And so therefore, unfortunately, for those people, you shouldn't be drinking coffee.
So coffee slows it down, basically.
Yeah.
And therefore, that will make your menopausal symptoms much worse.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yep, absolutely. So I hate to be bearer of bad news, but you need to up your magnesium and reduce your coffee.
And then just talking about B vitamins for methylation, just for people who aren't in the profession, can you just explain how they can get rid of estrogen, or make sure estrogen clears efficiently, whether they should be using methylated or non-methylated?
Sure. So in the methylation cycle, we use pretty much, not all, but predominantly a lot of the B vitamins. And I'm sure you all know B2, loads of them. So the thing is, if you're low in folate, or if you're low in B6 or B2, for instance, again, you can check those. That, first of all, is going to have an effect on the ability to make what we call these methyl transferases. So in other words, to be able to make this metabolite that's going to attach to estrogen. So if we haven't got sufficient amounts of those, then the ability to actually make those methyl transferases is just basically we will make less of them, and therefore that's going to affect that COMT gene in being able to actually get rid of it. So B vitamins, zinc and magnesium are major for estrogen, sort of just estrogen, production and detoxification is just basically needed all the time.
Yeah, because I think there's a bit of confusion there around, if you're low in estrogen or lowering estrogen when you're in menopause, do you want to actually get rid of it? And that's where people get really confused about whether, well, why would I want to get rid of it when I'm low in it anyway? So it's understanding that estrogen can go one or two ways as you're metabolizing it.
Absolutely. But also, estrogen needs to come, you need to make it needs to do its job, and then you need to get rid of it. What you don't want to do is, you don't really want estrogen hanging around, because all it does is it just recirculates, and then that's when it becomes a bit of an issue. We have more inflammation. It's not in its normal form, so the body doesn't recognize it as well. So therefore, then other issues start to happen. So yes, you're right. Of course, estrogen levels do reduce, and that's the point of menopause, so that we no longer have babies. But when we do have estrogen, we do need to get rid of it once it's done its job. Yeah,
exactly. And what we don't want to do is send estrogen down the wrong pathway, because then that's a risk factor for other things.
Yes,
like
absolutely.
Breast cancer, or any of those. So we want to make sure that once it's done its job, it has its safe exit.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the safe, or the major safe exit, is this COMT gene. So, basically ensuring you have that magnesium, reducing that caffeine, and ensuring you get those B vitamins, magnesium in, you are doing the best that you can do. And of course, there are herbal preparations, which I'm sure you have spoken about in the past.
I have. I've talked lots about that. I think just before we kind of close, from my point of view, that when estrogen gets to that end stage and it's done what it needed to do, whether it's lower than you want it to be, you need to make sure it's safe exit. and one of those routes is through the bowel. So if you're even slightly constipated, then there's a potential for estrogen to recirculate. So we want to make sure that we're saying goodbye to it nicely and getting rid of it efficiently through the bowel. So constipation is one of those factors that is a limiting factor. So herbs can really help then. I've done lots on herbs already. So this is your show tonight, Karen, where you're just explaining about the genetics, because I just don't think people understand it. And I think people think that automatically, just because their mum went psycho through menopause, that that's going to happen to them as well. But there's lots of things that we can do to prevent that from happening, and also know it's coming, and therefore put the steps in place to prevent that from happening.
Absolutely. And you know, prevention these days is really the you know, is really the only way that you're going to take control of, you know, what you can do. And I always find that if you know the information, you can actively do something about it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And you know, from a genetic perspective and from the reports that I produce, they're all of every single stage can be modified either through nutrition or through herbs. So you know, it's not a case of, oh, I've got this result, I can't do anything about it. It's actively finding out and then being able to go, right, okay, I know I've got to make sure that I'm eating magnesium rich foods on a daily basis, because that's exactly what my body needs. So yeah,
I always think that, I think I heard you say it years ago, but we are the lifeguard of our genes. So knowing that that's what's in our heritage and doing something about it to prevent it from expressing itself. So it would be good maybe on another occasion to look at a genetic test for menopause and estrogen and stuff, and then just kind of delve deeper into that. So listen, thank you so much. Do you want to just let people know how they contact you for your testing, Karen?
Sure, they can. It's karen@teamgene.co.uk, or Team Gene as in the website. You can go on there, .com, and you can use the little comments field, and you can just fill out your stuff and I'll answer.
Amazing. Listen, thank you so much for your time.
No,
really
thank
appreciate
you.
it.
It's been amazing. Thank you for asking me.
You know, hopefully we'll be able to do a bit more on just understanding what a test result looks like and what we can do about it, so that it's kind of, we're working from a place of prevention rather than kind of crisis management. So
absolutely, yeah, for sure.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Now, but thank you, Karen.
No worries.
See you soon. Bye.